This is Chapter 7, Part 3. Let's pick up and talk about causality a little bit. By causality, this is a central goal of any scientific research, is that you want to try to determine what is causing what. If we stick with this violence example, we want to determine what is causing people to be violent. What are the factors? Usually it's going to be more than one thing. What are the factors that cause somebody to act that way? That's just a basic approach of the scientific method, is to assume that there are things that are causing you to behave like you behave. So the explanation is why are things the way they are? What sort of people or what kinds of things lead people to become violent? So it's a key part of us understanding what it is we're studying, and you're not going to be able to try to fight against that behavior. If it's a bad behavior like violence, you're not going to be able to reduce it and prevent it unless you know what is causing it, because then you can attack the cause and address the cause of it, and hopefully successfully reduce it. So cause and effect are very important. And the problem is that with quantitative research, if you're doing experimental research, that's typically quantitative, using numbers. And as I've said before, it's done a lot in psychology when we're talking about human behavior. It's a method that's really good at this issue of what's causing what. But in our disciplines, sociology and social work, we tend to rely on methods like distributing a questionnaire and getting answers, and then reducing those answers to numbers and doing a statistical analysis of the relationship between those different answers to questions. How many of your friends get in trouble with the law, and correlating with that, see if people who say that they have lots of friends who are criminals, if they're the ones who are most likely to, say, commit acts of violence or other criminal activities. So since we look for correlations, if when you see lots of delinquent friends, do you also see at the same time lots of violence? That's a correlation. The problem with that is that we're not able to really know for sure if your delinquent friends are causing you to become violent, because another possibility is this question of the direction of causal influence that you see there on the screen. Just because two things are connected to each other, yeah, there is a tendency for people who are violent to have delinquent friends. Yeah, it's true. That doesn't necessarily mean that your friends are making you or causing you to become a violent person. It could be that the causal arrow, the direction of the causal influence, is going the other way. It might be that you are a violent-prone person who likes friends that are similar to yourself. Usually, if you pick a friend, you like to pick people who are like you. And if you like raising hell and getting into fights with people, well, you're probably going to want to find friends to do the same thing. So it may not be a big, huge surprise to find that a violent person has, criminally prone friends, because he might have sought them out. He might have looked for those kind of friends, and those kind of friends might not look for him as a friend. So it may be his sort of violent tendencies, what he likes to do, is what's causing this connection with delinquent friends. He has sought these people out and made friends with them, so it's not his friends are making him be violent. He was already violent in the first place. So, see, just because there's a connection, it doesn't mean you know for sure what's causing what. So this is a problem with the survey research, the quantitative stuff that we use in our disciplines, is very often we're not able to know for sure what's causing what. So that's a big problem. As a matter of fact, you should mark that down as a weakness of studies that use correlations and statistical analysis, unless it's experiments, that it's hard to know what's causing what. That's a problem. And finally, the confidence issue, confidence in the researcher's causal inferences. The textbook doesn't stress this too much, but let me say that another problem with quantitative statistical analysis is that you might find in your data, you collect data on a sample of people, and you find that those that have more criminal friends tend to be criminals themselves and break the law themselves. You find a correlation there. But with statistics, there's always a possibility that could just be a fluke. It could just be an accident of your sample. And that if you did it again, if you found another sample of people and collected the data and looked at the correlations, you might find that there was no correlation the next time you looked, and that the fact that you did find a correlation the first time was just a fluke. It was just an accident. So one of the things that statistical analysis, quantitative analysis requires you to do is use statistics to help give you the chance that your results are just due to luck, just a fluke. And the statistical techniques can teach you how to be able to figure out what the chances are that this is a real finding, that it really is true, or if it's just a fluke that happened in your sample in your particular study. So confidence over your results is an issue. Like with any sort of research, it's an issue for quantitative research too. Now, we talked about how generalization is hard to do when you have really small sample, like you're doing that single case study. You're only maybe studying one person in depth, maybe talking to them a few times a week for months, and really getting to know them and learning about that person. Well, in that kind of situation, it's really difficult to know if what you learned about that person applies to other people. It's hard to generalize your findings from a small little sample. In the most extreme situation, only one person. It's hard to be able to say, well, what's true for this person is true for everybody. Very hard to do that. The smaller the sample, the smaller the number of people that you study. So there's the issue. All studies have the issue of do the findings that we report in this study, do they apply beyond the sample, beyond just the study? Are they true for people out there in the real world and true generally or not? And that's an issue in all research methods. But let me say that this is typically a strength in the type of quantitative research that's done in sociology and social work and criminology. We tend to get large samples, hundreds of people, who tell us answers to these questions. And the bigger your sample is, the more confidence you have that this is going to be true for not only your sample, the handful of people, or the people that were selected to participate in your study, that it's true not only for them, but it's true for the general population, for everybody that you're trying to learn something about. We use samples to try to learn about everybody, because we don't have time and money to study every person. Let's say our population is the United States. That's 330 million people. That's too many people to interview, to give everybody a survey and collect and analyze all their data. Way too much. So maybe we can handle 500 people. So that's a sample. So the question is, what we find for the 500, how confident can we be that it is true for the entire population of 330 million people? Well, if you've got a bigger sample, you've got more confidence that what you find is true for the whole population. Bigger the sample, the more powerful your methods. So that's actually tends to be a strength with our type of research, where we're in sociology, social work, where we're using large samples and doing surveys. In experiments in psychology, or in some other fields like psychiatry, or maybe brain science would be another example of this. They might only have 10 or 20 people in their sample, and that is very hard to be able to generalize to the whole population from only 10 or 20 people. That's a problem with these. We'll talk about these qualitative methods, where you do in-depth interviews and focus on words instead of numbers, and you only do that for 10 or 20 or 30 people. It's very hard to generalize to the whole population from such a small little sample. So for those sorts of methods, experiments, brain scans, neuroscience, that kind of thing, these in-depth interviews, sample sizes of 20 or 30, that's a weakness. That's a limitation. The survey research, the statistical analysis of hundreds of people, more powerful, better able to generalize. So that's really a strength of quantitative research, at least when it's used for surveys where we're able to get lots and lots of people. But it's not enough just to get a big sample. At least as important, probably more important, to be honest, bottom line, this next one is more important. That's how representative is the sample. This sample has got to be a cross-section. It's got to be an accurate little slice of your entire population. So if you're trying to select a sample that's going to reflect the reality for all Americans, 330 people, well, you better not have only guys in your sample, or only women in your sample, or only whites in your sample, or only Catholics in your sample. You need to have a sample that is representative and reflects what the whole country looks like, what their characteristics are and traits. If you don't have a representative sample, then you're not going to be able to generalize your findings from your sample to the entire population. There's a very good chance you're going to get it wrong because your sample is not a reflection. It doesn't match, doesn't look like the whole population. So why would you expect your findings to match up with what's true for the entire population when your sample's not even an accurate slice? So that's called representativeness. And absolutely crucial that you get a representative sample. If you don't, then you're on shaky ground about whether your findings really apply to everybody or not. So representativeness is very important issue. And some of these will come up again when we talk about sampling in the future. Now, replication, we've already talked about this before. Again, these authors have a tendency to kind of bring things up again and again. And so, as I've said before, that with replication, it's a very important part of science to be able to, it's not enough to just trust one study because something weird can go wrong in any single study. We talked about flukes a minute ago, accidents. You can find anything in one study. So you want to have repeat studies, replication studies, and the more times that you do independent studies, the same kind of study was done before, and they're all giving the same results, they're all telling the same story, then you have more and more confidence that you've got the truth, that you're really onto something. And so they just have listed here minimizing contamination from research biases or values. So everybody brings their humanity, their own values, their own perceptions, their own bias into their study. And it tends to, when you bring your own stuff into the study, it tends to push things in one way or another. But if you've got a lot of different researchers, and especially if they're diverse, if they approach things very differently, if they have a very different take on things, then if you do a bunch of studies and they still point to the same results, even though the researchers doing the studies were very different from each other and had different biases or values or approaches to things, that's a lot of evidence that you're really onto something, because even when you got some bias in there, you're still getting the same results from one study to the next. So that's a sign that you're onto something. It increases your confidence. I've already talked about before about if you're going to do a study, you want to really lay out exactly how you did it. So if somebody wants to come along and do the same thing you did to do a replication and see if they come up with the same thing you came up with, even though they're a completely different person, completely independent, and they come up with the same thing you did, then that's great news. Again, and it builds confidence. But you've got to lay out exactly how you did it so they know how to repeat your procedures. And so you have to do it exactly the same control of conditions. So the study needs to be, where it's important, it needs to be a true replication. It needs to be done the same way. But you may also, it talks here about differing contexts. You may also want to see if the study's findings will apply in maybe a little bit of a different situation. So it's not exactly replication, but let's say I did a study and I had college students volunteer to take one of my online surveys, and I get a certain set of results. And somebody else wants to use my same survey, but they want to try, but the group of students that they have access to are high school students. And so they might want to see if they get the same results as I got with a different group of students. high school students instead of college students. So it's, it's a little bit different. It's not exactly a replication, but it does give us sort of more confidence if I get certain findings with college students, and then this other researcher gets the same results with high school students, then that again increases our confidence that we're onto the truth. We've got something because it was done in, it's done in the same consistent way, except you've got different people, different kinds of people, different age, different context setting, and yet you find the same thing. So that's, again, builds confidence that you're getting accurate, valid results that hold up again and again even in different contexts. Now, I'm not going to go through all these steps. This is just a little bit of a rehash. How this here, as we see this operationalization and quantification, like I was talking about earlier. You go from theory to hypothesis to how you're going to design your study and get your data. Then you devise measure your concepts. How are you going to measure those concepts with numbers? So that's the quantification, the operationalization, and then you're going to select where you're going to do your study, maybe on a college campus. You select who your research subjects or respondents are going to be. Maybe I'm going to get my students from classes to volunteer and help me out on the surveys. So then I administer the research instruments. That's just a fancy way of saying I invite you folks to go to the online website where you take my online survey. And that website collects all the data for you folks, and then I process the data and I analyze it, and I see what the findings are. I see, again, let's say if my hypothesis is I think that if you've got a lot of delinquent friends, you're probably more delinquent yourself, and I look at this data to see if it backs up and supports my hypothesis. And let's say it does, that I found in my sample of college students that those students that had more rowdy, criminally inclined friends, those students were more likely to get in trouble themselves and be up to no good, breaking the law and stuff like that. So I found, in this case, I would have found support for my hypothesis. I write this up in the findings and the conclusions. And once you've written that paper up, you're finished. You get the paper published someplace so other people know what your study was and what you found. And we're done. So and then we can start all over again and kind of branch off and go in a new direction with the theory. So you see those arrows go around and around, right? So that's the process. Again, where quantification or operationalization are good words for this process here. Now, the final thing I'll do in this section, and we'll wrap it up. I'm going to skip the last couple of PowerPoint slides because they take things a little too far, and the last couple of slides don't worry too much. But you always want to know for this course the pros and the cons for any sort of type of research. And the pros we've talked about here some well, let me talk about those more, but until they get to the chapter really only talks about criticisms. We want to be pro as well as con. So the pros for quantitative research is that quantitative research tends to be very precise. When you're using numbers, you can be very precise and refined in your measurements, as opposed to words. Words, if your focus is words and you're doing qualitative research, it can be not quite as precise. It can be more vague. And, it's not a good word, but it's like kind of sloppy if you're relying on words. Words are not always so precise. Numbers are more precise. So you have precision that comes with quantitative research. Also, you tend to get large samples with quantitative research, which allows you to more confidently generalize to the total population what your findings are. So in my study, not only do I believe that I find in my sample that if you have a lot of delinquent friends, that there's a tendency for you to be breaking the law too. Not only did I find that was true in my sample of college students, say 500 college students, but I can pretty confidently say that I can generalize this to other college students around the country because I've got a big sample, and college students in other places are, at least arguably similar to the college students here that were in my sample. So especially with a big sample, I can more confidently generalize. So that tends to be a strength of quantitative research, at least the survey stuff, the big stuff. Experimental research, which uses numbers and is often quantitative, those experiments a lot of times are small samples, and that makes it harder to generalize to everybody out there in the world, the population. So that's one strength. Big samples, precise measurement. There's just a lot. It's a very mathematical, rigorous, precise approach when you do quantitative. So it's imitating the methods that are used in the hard sciences, chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, all of those fields. And so you get that rigor and tough testing and precise measurements similar to what you get in the harder sciences. So you're able to sort of better be able to test whether theories are true or not. It's good for theory testing to use quantitative methods. So those are at least some of the positives. Now let's focus on how the textbook stresses the negatives. They would stress that there's a lot of quantitative research can be sort of superficial because you're asking quick little questions. How many times did you do this? How many times did you do that? How would you describe yourself? This, that, or another. And it's when I give an online questionnaire, it might be 10 minutes. So it's quick, it's to the point. And some people would say, well, sometimes that could be superficial, shallow. It's not really getting you the depth and the complexity of what it is you're studying. And so it can be a little, that's superficial. And the world is, the point that they're making here, the authors are making, is that the human beings are complex, and it's hard to reduce what they're like down to numbers. And you got to get the big picture when you interview them and you get to know them over a long period of time. And again, the focus on conversation and dialogue and not short little questionnaire questions. The idea is that you get a richer, fuller picture. You're closer to the truth because it's less superficial. And so you see this term artificial here, that's one criticism that's made of the quantitative research, that numbers can be superficial or artificial and they don't necessarily get at the truth of complex human beings. And they would also say that it seems like it's precise and accurate, but a lot of times statistics are not very valid and they give you numbers that are way off from the truth, and that they're so, sometimes the accuracy of numbers is overblown. That's a criticism you could make about it. Now, this lack of ecological validity, again, they might say that, well, the survey doesn't really get at real life and ordinary day-to-day lives of people because it's a little bit removed. You sit down 10 minutes, you answer these questions, and you're not really getting at the reality of a person's day-to-day complicated life. And so it lacks that ecological validity. As you remember, that's referring to sort of, does it get at the truth of people's everyday lives or not? And so again, people who are critics of this approach of using numbers think that it's sort of somehow artificial. It's not getting at the truth of things. And also, statistical analysis tends to be, some people would say static, where it's like, okay, how many friends you have that are delinquent? Okay, and how many times have you broken the law in the past year? And look into the correlation between those two things. So it's sort of, they would say they would say that the reality is more complicated than that, and it has this sort of take a picture. That's what they mean by static view. It's almost like taking a survey is like taking a snapshot of you, and so it's only showing what you're like in just that moment. Whereas maybe life is more like is going to get captured more validly, but with a video camera, where it's looking at you over time and for a long time, and you're going to get a better reality if you, with a video, think of video versus a picture, a snapshot. So these folks would say a typical quantitative study is going to be a snapshot, and it's not going to be as good in their minds as a video. So that'll help you differentiate the two. So again, there's pros and cons with every approach, every research design and method, and that's certainly true of quantitative. Let me say, though, that especially in criminology, for those of you who are criminology majors, criminology tends to be skewed towards quantitative research. And really, even sociology and social work, probably there's more people who do quantitative studies, and more quantitative studies get published than the qualitative ones. So in all these disciplines, I think, but especially criminology, which I know best, it's very much dominated by the quantitative research. In this class, we will definitely want to be fair and cover all bases and not leave anything out. But just so you know the kind of the reality of how the discipline works, that there is the social sciences, definitely psychology, do a lot of quantitative work because they believe in the scientific method as is done in the harder sciences, and they're trying to be like the scientists in the harder scientists and uses the precision of numbers and use that, statistics and all of these sort of sophisticated approaches to learn more about our social world. So that again tends to be quite popular. So we'll stop there. Again, I'm skipping some of the less important items and focus just because I wanted to focus on those that are really, in my mind, key. So we'll end it right there.